Hi, my researcher that I am presenting on for the final project is Dr. Matthew Tincani, and I'll be talking about some of his research and the impact that it's had on the field of behavior analysis and me as a beginning behavior analysis. So, a little bit about Dr. Tincani. He currently holds a BCBAD certification, so that means he is a board certified behavioral analysis analyst at the doctorate level. He received his bachelor's from Westchester University, his master's of education from Temple, his PhD is from Ohio State University, and currently he is an associate professor of ABA at Temple University in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. His research interests include children and adolescents with autism spectrum disorder, and he mainly focuses on communication and social skills training, and primarily PECS training, so picture exchange communication systems, which is exchanging pictures for items that a child wants. So using it for manding, which is requesting items. And he also has had a recent shift in his research interests to include underserved populations. And what that means is he's now interested in how to create interventions that are appropriate for these populations, as well as how to make sure that they receive those services, because he's found that there's been some disparities between the services that um, privileged or white clients may receive and underserved populations such as African Americans, Native Americans, Pacific Islanders, and other minorities. So, in regards to his contribution to the literature, um, I read 5 articles by him. 3 of them talked about PECs and their effect on manding, so I'll start with those. Um, In this first study, they looked at the effect of PECs on manding and the development of speech as well. And in this study, both participants did show an increased level of independent manding after being trained on how to use PECs as a communication system. And they also generalized their new skills to their teachers in the classroom. So that means that they were able to use this communication system with more than one person, which is very important. One of the 2 participants showed a measurable increase in their speech, although it was only vocal approximations and not actual uh, legible speech necessarily. They did show that increase, and this kind of posed the question for the researchers of PECs potentially being an effective way to produce speech in its users. Obviously, right now, the main function of using PECs is for manding, so that's requesting items, like I said earlier. But this study kind of brings up the idea that it could potentially be used as a way to increase speech itself in its users, would be a nice secondary application for it. So, another study kind of goes along with the first one, and it talks about how the participants who used PECs at their highest mastered level, whether that was level 2, level 3, level 4, it just was completely up to them, and how high of a level the participants could obtain. They showed moderate improvements in communication, and they found that age, gender, and diagnosis didn't have a direct effect on their improvements. So whether a child was 3, 5, if it was a boy or a girl, and no matter what diagnosis they had, whether it was autism, pervasive developmental disorder, not otherwise specified, or even in this case, there were some participants who did not have a diagnosis at all. They found that that did not affect how well or how quickly a child improved using PECs. So this also shows that PECs could potentially be another good intervention for children who don't necessarily have a diagnosis, whether it's just because it's not yet diagnosed, or maybe they just have been showing delays, but they have not received a diagnosis yet. It can also be another effective intervention for them. And again, in this study, there were some participants that had varying increases in improvement in speech as well as communication initiation. So this is just another research study that kind of brings up the question of, can PECs be used for more than just manding? So it's very interesting to see that multiple studies kind of showed that increase in speech, even though that was not the primary focus of the training. And in this last study that is about PECs, he also compared the use of sign language and PECs for communication training. So what Dr. Tincani did was he compared the effectiveness of PECs versus the effectiveness of learning sign language to acquire MANs, and as well as increase vocal behavior. And he found that the effectiveness for for each intervention varied by participant. And what he found, which didn't actually go with previous research that showed sign language showed the most increase in acquiring MANs, was that the participants' hand motor imitation played a role in which one was most effective. So what that means is the participant who had weaker hand motor imitation kind of picked up PECs more easily because they don't have to use their hands to imitate any signs that they're being taught. And then the other learner who had moderate hand motor imitation skills picked up sign language more easily, and they were able to emit more MANs using sign language. And this is really interesting since the past research suggested that sign language was the intervention which increased manding the most. So it kind of looks at potential limitations or implications of past studies where maybe they didn't look at the abilities of the students or the participants that were used. So if they just happened to have better hand motor imitation skills at the beginning of the study, they might kind of raise the results for sign language, whereas if there was more participants who had a weaker hand motor imitation, they would have preferred to use PECs instead because that doesn't require as much motor imitation. And both participants produced more vocalization, so there wasn't any difference between using PECs or sign language. Using any communication training actually helped produce more vocalizations in participants. This next study is a little bit different. It doesn't involve communication training. It's looking at brief versus extended functional analyses. And they actually found that brief functional analyses, or FAs, were able to identify the function of behavior at the same rate as extended functional analysis. So this means that researchers or clinicians can save time by using a brief FA, and then that means they can kind of expedite the process and they can move to intervention more quickly. And in this study in particular, the brief FA also included functional communication training, so they taught these participants replacement behaviors for their maladaptive ones, which is very helpful, which again is kind of expediting the process of creating an intervention. But we still need to be aware of confounding establishing operations that might happen in these studies. For example, if a child who is usually very motivated by food, so they might engage in behaviors to gain access to food or another tangible, had a really big breakfast in the morning, or they had access to that tangible before session for an extended period of time, that might kind of confound that session's data. So it might have lower rates than it would normally be. So they also suggested having multiple sessions across multiple days for the brief FA, which will still save time, but it just makes sure that we are aware of potential confounding variables. And lastly, I figured I should include a study that's based on Dr. Tincani's most recent research interests. So that's the effect of race and culture on autism spectrum disorder. The study found that autism is underrepresented in minority cultures, and now it's due to a variety of different factors, including decreased access to healthcare. So that would mean they wouldn't have access to a provider to diagnose autism, let alone to be able to get it treated or receive services. Poverty, which would mean they don't have the money to afford services. Location, a big example of that would be more rural areas, or if they're in the inner city, places that don't receive a lot of funding, they might not have access to getting a diagnosis or receiving services. And there's a lot of other cultural factors, such as the parents' acceptance, their views towards disabilities or diagnosis such as autism or other developmental delays that might hinder a child's ability to receive a diagnosis. Another major key that they talked about was the fact that a lot of services that children may receive if they do have a diagnosis and they do end up in a school where they can receive services is that these assistive communication devices are most often in English, since that is the language that is taught in most schools. So then if they go home and they're a second language learner, their language in the home might be different than the language on their device. So in that case, it wouldn't be an effective intervention because it can't be used at home. It'd be very difficult to generalize if the parents don't understand English as well, or if they're not able to help the child use the device. So just some similarities that I noticed in his literature was that most of his studies were single subject design, or they included very few participants, usually between 2 and 5 participants. So that just means that there's potential that he would need to replicate some of these studies just to ensure that it's not just these participants and that it can actually generalize to other populations. His main focus, obviously, is on PECs and other communication training, mostly manding. And that makes me curious if he'll have a later focus on PECs to increase speech, since multiple of his studies actually mentioned that it increased speech, even though that's kind of a secondary use for the intervention. And his newer focus on interventions for underserved populations. He talks about a gap in services for minority populations, and he aims to find why the gap exists. So when we're talking about poverty and lack of health care and lack of access due to location and things like that. So understanding why the gap exists so that we can close it. Because if we don't know why there is a gap in the literature and in the services provided to these populations, then we're never going to be able to actually help serve them. I did try to interview Dr. Tincani, but I did not receive a response. I emailed him and I left a voicemail. And so his impact on the field of behavior analysis, um, he did extensive PECs and communication training studies. Aside from just the ones I talked about, there was multiple other that I browsed. So he did provide me with a lot of information about PECs. It's something that I knew existed and that I've known a lot of other clinicians I've worked with have kind of avoided, so I wasn't sure about it, but now I feel like I'm more aware of how effective it can be, and especially because it has the use of potentially improving speech in some participants as well. So that kind of opens the door to look at that more as well. Um, and he brought up the implication of hand motor imitation skills when choosing communication training. So the fact that PECs versus sign language, the fact that hand motor imitation skills played a factor in which intervention was more effective for a participant is very important, because now we can look at that when we're trying to decide on an intervention versus just going off of past data that suggested that sign language would produce more MANs, which would be great, but if a learner doesn't have that repertoire of imitation skills, sign language would be very difficult for them. Obviously, the use of brief FAs instead of extended is very important because it can save time for clinicians, and it will also expedite the process for intervention. So the quicker you can get through an FA, find out the function of behavior, the faster you can kind of get an intervention in place that focuses on that function and replacing those maladaptive behaviors. And of course, focusing on underserved populations is important because although there is no reason for there to be a bridge in services between different populations, obviously one exists, and they've talked about that, and making sure that we can find out why it's happening, as well as how to change it and how to create interventions that are best for these underserved populations, is very important to the field, because we have to ensure that everyone can receive services. So obviously this different array of work has been very important to behavior analysis, and it's definitely going to help me in the future as a behavior analyst, I'm sorry. So that is Dr. Tincani and his work. And this is my bibliography. Thank you.